Spectrovision Radio.
First, I'll tell you what I told the police all those years ago, plus a few insights I've gained with age and the passing of time. Mine wasn't what you'd call a happy home. I don't think my parents were ever meant to have a child together. I assumed I was an accident which meant they suddenly found themselves playing house, pretending to be a family I guess neither of them were built for, nor particularly wanted. That's not to say it was all utter misery. It wasn't. Big chunks of my childhood, up until what happened, were an experience I'm sure might even be called typical. And despite their flaws, both my parents were capable of showing love to me in small, quiet moments. The whole thing just wasn't built right, like a building erected on shoddy foundations, doomed to collapse. But my key memory of that night, the one where this story starts, is of listening to them yell at each other downstairs while I lay in bed trying to go to sleep. They often argued about everything: money, other men and women. They even argued about me, saying stuff I wish I'd never had to hear. It was a common bedtime routine, laying there awake, listening to them yell at each other, to the smashing of crockery as they hurled plates and glasses at each other, slammed doors. Inevitably, it would stop at some point, but I wouldn't go to sleep. I'd be wide awake, the stress of the situation meaning I was far from slumber. It was always the same, so I'll tell you about the first time I was visited. I lay paralyzed with fear as she slid out from under my bed and stood over me. She was a tall, slender woman with long, straight hair who wore a black suit that made her look like a magician or a mime. What her face truly looked like is a mystery even to me now, but I remember she looked young and old at the same time. But what was deeply strange was that the initial shock of her bizarre entrance into my life dissipated so fast as I squinted at her through the dark. I remember her eyes most of all. They were what made me trust her. They were impossibly big, bigger than I even knew people could have. She smiled down at me and whispered that her name was Miss Ember. I told her my name, but she said she already knew it, that she knew all about me, and that she'd been patiently waiting for a chance to meet me. She asked me if I wanted to go for a walk. I don't know why, but I found myself not even questioning the impossibility of that request. That in the dead of night, while my parents slept, I'd get out of bed and head out onto the street with a stranger who'd emerged from under my bed. So I went with her. The street was quiet, and we walked side by side, neither of us speaking. I didn't know where we were going, and Miss Ember didn't tell me. When we'd been walking for a little while down our street, I spotted the Kotzers, neighbors of ours, who I knew pretty well. Their son Hamish was in my class at school, though we weren't exactly friends. But their heads didn't turn in our direction, not even when we came within a few feet of them. And I realized, somehow, that they couldn't see me. "Did you like that?" Miss Ember asked. "What?" I replied. "That they couldn't see you," she said, motioning to the Kotzers, who still seemed utterly oblivious to our existence as we passed them by and left them behind. I didn't understand the question or what the right answer might be, so I said nothing, and we kept on walking. Even though our street was long, it seemed to have become impossibly elongated that night, like it might be never-ending, but we kept going. We walked so far that we somehow made some kind of loop, and I could see my house in the distance. But as we neared, I realized it wasn't quite what I thought it was. "What is this place?" I asked her. "This is where I practice," Miss Ember replied. We walked up to the door and she opened it without using a key. Stepping inside, I was greeted by an almost exact replica of the house I lived in. But it was like someone had reconstructed it from photographs and got it almost right, but had missed the nuances that only seeing it in reality could offer. Everything looked overly perfect, never used, not crooked or uneven enough the way real life is. We went up the stairs and into what looked almost exactly like my bedroom. Not quite versions of all my things were there too. clothes, toys, like counterfeits, mimics. But I must admit that it's only with the perspective of time that I'm able to describe them that way. Back then, I remember thinking how wonderful it all was. New, clean, unspoiled. After that, we spent I don't know how long playing games, watching movies, eating delicious food. It was like Miss Ember was able to predict what I would want. All I'd have to do was think about ice cream, and she'd suddenly appear with a couple of bowls of the stuff. At some point, as we sat there with full bellies, in front of yet another exciting movie my parents would never let me watch, Miss Ember asked me a question. "How would you feel if," she said, turning to face me, "instead of living with Mommy and Daddy, you came to live with me, and we could live like this all the time?" I stared back at her, stared into those impossibly large eyes. "I think I'd like that," I replied, but I didn't know what was meant to follow that. But Miss Ember smiled sympathetically, like she understood. "Of course," she said. "They're still your parents." She was right. That was it. My parents were imperfect, but they were mine. I was part of them, tethered to them, in a way which was somehow devastatingly sad and fundamentally important. "I can't tell you how and why it would be better," Miss Ember said, still staring at me. "But I can show you." With those words, it was like her head became a projector. Her skin became translucent, shining with a light which was burning from within her skull. Those giant eyes of hers suddenly became cavernous, and out of them came two beams of light, which she directed straight into my eyes. And I saw. It was pure peace, a motionless, tranquil nothing that seemed so powerful, so absolute. Her eyes became eyes again, her skin regained its depth, and she smiled at me. Seeing what I had, I knew I'd be much better off with Miss Ember, but I still couldn't stop thinking about my parents, about leaving them behind, about how difficult that seemed. It was as if Miss Ember could sense the trepidation in me. "Don't worry," she said soothingly. "It takes time, and I'm very, very patient." Then, suddenly, I was back in my bed, alone, as if I'd never left. Miss Ember kept coming to see me, and it played out the same every time. She'd appear from underneath my bed in the dark of night, and we'd walk to that replica of my house. And each time, the projector that was housed within her skull would come to life, and it would project that image of calm, of stillness, into me. Each time, it became more and more inviting, more and more undeniable. And then, one day, she finally asked the question, "Are you ready to come with me now?" Therapists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, I've seen them all. And they all told me the same thing, that the way I remembered it wasn't right. It was my childish mind trying to make sense of some things and protect me from others by creating a narrative to veil the horrible truth of what had happened that night. The narrative everyone else believed was that the person I referred to as Miss Ember actually only visited me once, that she had found her way into the house and was in the process of abducting me, but that the abduction had been interrupted, and that Miss Ember had severely injured my mother in the ensuing struggle before fleeing, leaving me behind. It all left me so discombobulated that I didn't know what to think anymore. In my memory, I wasn't even sure that Miss Ember was completely human. But the facts were the facts, they told me, and they were as follows. The police found unidentified blood at the scene. It was human, female, that had resulted from the mystery intruder's struggle with my mother. They found that same blood on the fence in the backyard, where it looked like someone had climbed over it to flee the scene. A witness, though potentially unreliable, who was doing drugs in the woods behind the house, said they saw a tall, slender woman, dressed in all black, running through the trees in the dead of night. That night. But no one could answer two key questions. How did she get into the house? And who the hell was she? My dad died just over a year after the incident. His drinking had ramped up to insurmountable levels in the interim. It got so excessive that it led to an arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat, which caused a sudden cardiac arrest that killed him in his sleep one night. With Dad gone and my mom unable to take care of me due to the brain injury she'd sustained during the incident, I went to live with my auntie and uncle. They tried their absolute hardest, I can say that much. It wasn't easy on them or my two cousins to have this traumatized, problematic kid suddenly thrust into their family. But they tried. We all tried. And we got close to something I guess you could call pretty good, all things considered. They'd take me to visit my mom. For a while, I found it scary. It was like interacting with a stranger who barely resembled my mother at all, and in some ways seemed younger than I was. But I learned to accept it for what it was, and stopped resenting that time spent with her every week. Sometimes, I could tell there was still a part of her that relished those visits, understood who I was, no matter how little she was able to literally express that. Other times, it was like I could have been anyone else in the world. Life continued, in a way I guess it has a habit of doing. I went to school, I made friends. Miss Ember became this thing that was simply ignored, siloed off. But whenever I went to visit my mother, or whenever something, often something seemingly completely unconnected, would cause me to think back on it, it was as if I could feel a dormant mass lodged in the recesses of my brain slowly reactivating. You know how when you fall asleep on your arm, and then it's completely numb? That tingling sensation you get as blood flows back into it and it starts to wake up. That's how it felt. But as I got older, the odd numbness shifted, became something else. One day when I was in high school, I accidentally came across a news article about what had happened when I was doing research for a paper on significant historical events in our town. The article was as mysterious and lacking in certainties as I'd been told my memory was. It did something to me. The void of truth, when it came to what had happened, suddenly seemed like the most important thing in the world. And that mass I'd felt within me steadily grew until it had replaced my entire head. It became all I thought about. And the more years I spent thinking about it, what had happened to my mom, to us, and the guilt I felt for it on my part, guilt I didn't truly understand, began to drive my obsession more than anything. I became consumed with trying to solve what the police hadn't been able to get some kind of closure, maybe even some kind of retribution. And a couple times, I came close to thinking I was really onto something. I discovered that there had been a series of unexplained deaths of kids, around the age I'd been, when Miss Ember had visited me, and around the same time. They'd all vanished in different parts of the country, all within a period of 6 years. Kids who disappeared from their homes, and who were found elsewhere only when it was already too late. The only link between them all was that the victims showed not a single sign of having been physically harmed in any way. Where they'd been while they'd been missing, or how they'd died, was a complete mystery. They were simply dead, with no clue as to what had caused it. I took it to the cops, suggested that they look into how the cases might be linked to what had happened to me and my family, which I was already doing myself. They nodded and assured me they'd look into it, but every time I contacted them after that, I was simply told there had been no new developments. The other time I thought I was onto something was on what you might call the other end of the spectrum, not knowing whether I truly was investigating a person or not. My research turned to the otherworldly, and I stumbled across the concept of the Coco. The Coco, a paranormal entity, originated as a concept on the Iberian Peninsula, more concretely in northwestern Spain and Portugal. It was a being that supposedly kidnapped children in the night in order to devour them. Was it just a tall tale to get kids to fall in line, or was there something to it? And what did devour mean, exactly? Those kids who'd been found, with no explanation as to what had caused them to die, had they been devoured in some way that was nothing to do with the physical realm? That was something else? I found myself going down rabbit holes, wondering if the Coco had somehow made it over to the Americas during Spanish colonization. But then I sense-checked myself. My mother had Spanish heritage, and I wondered if that simply meant she told me about it at some point, invoked the idea to try to get me to behave, and I simply didn't remember the fact. But maybe it was buried in my brain somewhere, and the sense I was onto something was really just the ringing bell of a distant memory. But not knowing what I was truly investigating only made my obsession grow, and it shapeshifted into what began to increasingly feel like an obligation. I needed vengeance. Maybe my family, with all its problems, wasn't much to take away, but it was ours, and Miss Ember had robbed us of it. Whatever she truly was, she had no right. I turned my attention to the house itself. A couple of families had lived there since what had happened. By the time I decided to start properly investigating the place, it was occupied by the Barcenas, a family much like mine had been. A father, a mother, and a young son. After I'd gleaned all I could from the exterior, which didn't take long, and offered up little, I made the decision to break in while they were out one day, having studied their routine, so I knew that I had enough time. There are a series of 3 small windows on one side of the house. If you're walking along the path beside them, they're level with your feet. They let light and air into the basement of the house to avoid damp and mold setting in. In my casing of the place, I gently pushed those windows, testing them, and had found that the last of the 3 had a loose enough lock for me to break it and it not be obvious. The Barcenas would never notice, and even from the outside, it looked like it was shut tight. But from then on, all it took was a nudge for it to rise open just enough for me to get down onto the ground and slide through it. And just like that, I was in. I repeated that journey a handful of times, learning more about the family who lived there, the Barcenas, but nothing that would give me any clues as to what had really happened all those years ago. When my big break came, it came completely by accident. I'd come back down into the basement after another fruitless investigation of the house, questioning how many more times it was worth doing before I drew a line under the whole thing. As I hoisted myself up to climb back out of the window, I slipped and fell backwards. I tried to land on my feet, but my legs were too straight, and I fell to my left, hitting the wall hard. I cursed myself as I shuffled back to my feet, shoulder throbbing. But as I straightened up, I saw that my shoulder hitting the wall had dislodged something. A wooden panel in the section of the wall that made up the covering below the stairs that took you up from the basement to the first floor had moved, and I could see only dark space beyond. I pulled the panel completely away from the wall and directed my flashlight into the opening. It looked like some kind of crawl space, maybe. It was narrow, and the beam from my flashlight wasn't enough for me to see where it might end. I climbed in. It was so small I had to slither along on my belly like a snake, and I found myself worrying about what would happen if I got stuck, unable to back out. But before I could entertain the idea of retreat, my hand hit something which made a crinkling kind of noise. I shone my flashlight at it. It was a food wrapper for a cereal bar, a brand I didn't recognize. I picked it up and studied it more closely. It was a little faded, but I could still see that the expiration date was almost 20 years ago. But lodged in that narrow crawl space wasn't a place to stop and contemplate the discovery I'd made, so I put it in my pocket and kept going. Soon enough, I hit a dead end. but shining my flashlight around, I quickly realized it wasn't quite that. There was a space above me, and the only way to go was up. There was just enough room for me to get into a crouched position and then slowly start to rise. I outstretched my arms and groped around until my hands hit something. A ledge, so I grabbed onto it and hauled myself up. And as I did, I realized where I was. I was in the ventilation system, peering through the vents, able to see into every room, one by one. I found the part of the system where the square tube I was in moved upwards, and I ascended once more, onto the second floor, having got my bearings and able to navigate to where I most wanted to go. Through the slats in the vent, I could see my old bedroom, and what I'd suspected, ever since I'd edged my way into that crawl space in the basement, was confirmed to me. This is how Miss Ember had got in, all those years ago. Whether it had been just once, as I'd been told, or many, many times. What mattered was that this is how she'd done it, that fateful night when my life changed forever. I wrapped my fingers around the slats and pushed the covering on the vent. It moved forwards easy enough, sliding upward, and I snaked my way out until I was on the floor of my old bedroom. It felt so strange, retracing Miss Ember's movements, her crawling along the floor over to the bed, slipping underneath it, and her waiting there, just like I was doing now. And in that moment, I told myself I'd do it every night, to protect the boy who now lived there, in case Miss Ember ever came back. How long was it in the end? All those times I crawled out of the vent, closed it behind me, and slid under the bed. All those nights I lay there waiting for Miss Ember to show up, which she inevitably seemed to never do. I began to wonder if anyone would ever see me as a protector if I was discovered, or if I was in danger of being labeled the monster, the terrifying being sneaking into a family's home night after night without them knowing, and hiding under their child's bed while they slept. Would anyone ever understand? One night, much like all the others, I finally got my answer. I'd broken in slightly early that day because it was a Wednesday. The family had dinner earlier than usual on Wednesdays, as Mr. Barcena had to get up early to visit his father at the care home he resided in before heading into the office. To say I was hyper alert that night would be a lie. I'd done this so many times, and nothing had ever happened, so I'd learned to spend much of my time zoning out into a kind of meditation-type state so the hours would pass more easily. But when it happened, when that sound came, I snapped out of it immediately. I heard the vent open. I listened, more intently than I'd ever listened to anything, as someone clambered out of it, making a lot more noise than I ever had, but still not enough to alert the family who were still eating dinner downstairs. I didn't think twice and went into autopilot, enacting the plan I'd played out over and over again in my mind should this event ever occur. I pulled the knife from my pocket and rolled out from under the bed, slashing out wildly as I did. I felt the knife connect more than once, and I heard her scream out in pain. Now on my feet, I expected to have the absolute upper hand, but she somehow still had enough power left to lunge at me, and we collided with a massive crash against the wall. In those frenzied moments we grappled with each other, I caught glimpses of thinning, spindly white hair, glistening in the rich blue sheen of the moonlight coming in through the window. I felt dry, sagging skin beneath my fingertips, and I realized I still didn't truly know exactly what I was fighting. But the strength it possessed was an easy match for mine, and I felt myself beginning to lose the battle, even though I'd injured it with my knife. As I struggled against it, I heard hurried, pounding footsteps getting closer. Mr. Barcena burst into the room with a gun and fired, before I even knew what was what. The bullet whizzed past me, deafening me in one ear, and hit the thing I was fighting, and it crumpled to the floor, becoming a motionless heap. I took the chance to make a break for it. I ran at Mr. Barcena, sending him toppling to the floor as I rushed past him and hauled myself as fast as I could down the stairs and to the back door. I sprinted across the backyard, down to the fence, and flung myself over it, into the woods. I kept running, past the point where the witness had seen someone do the very same thing all those years ago. Only this time, there was no one there. Sometime later, the cops paid me a visit. I'd practiced acting calm and ushered them into my apartment, but on the inside I was on fire, burning alive with the fear that this might be the end of the road for me. There were 2 of them, and the 3 of us crowded around my excuse for a dining table and sat down. They told me that they wanted me to know that the woman who'd entered our home and severely injured my mother all those years ago was dead, killed by the now owner of that very same house, which she'd broken into again all these years later. I stared back at them. My surprise was genuine, but not for the reasons they must have assumed. "Who was she?" I asked. "Amelia Emberton," the more talkative one of them said. "She had a motel key on her, and we were able to connect the dots from there." I still didn't quite get it, and I asked them how they knew it was the same person who had destroyed my family. "Maybe it's best we don't tell you," the quieter one said, but I insisted, made it clear to them I wasn't prepared to not know. "We found some journals at the motel," the talkative one said. He raised his hand when he saw I was about to speak. "No, I can't show them to you," he added, "but there was enough in there about her victims for us to link her to numerous cases." "Numerous cases?" I asked, repeating his words back at him. He nodded solemnly, and I thought of those mysterious deaths I'd once been convinced were linked to what had happened to me. But I still had a bigger question, one that would hopefully make at least some sense of the unmake-sensible. "Why?" I asked. The more talkative one sighed heavily, gave himself a pause before responding. "What I can tell you is this," he said. "Miss Emberton believed that consuming the souls of the young could keep her alive indefinitely." I tried to take it in, but he spoke again before the gears in my mind could really get going. "There is something else," he said. "It seems she may have had an accomplice. The man who shot her, defending his home. He insists there were 2 people in his son's room, and that the other one, a man, managed to get away before he could get a good look at him." "I see," I mumbled, feeling the fear rise up in me again. "It's strange," the talkative one continued. "There's nothing about an accomplice in Amelia Emberton's journals, and the staff at the motel say they only ever saw her alone." I nodded. "Strange," I replied. "We'll keep you posted if we identify the second man," the quieter one said, motioning to their partner that they should be on their way, and the pair of them got up, shook my hand, and left. I waited for the story to break in the press. It didn't take long. They reported that Amelia Emberton was 93 years old when she'd been shot and killed that night. I tried to square that away with the person I'd battled, a woman so strong she'd fought on through the multiple knife injuries I'd inflicted, and still managed to nearly cost me my life. A woman who'd climbed through the ventilation ducts all the way up to my old bedroom. All that at 93 years old. It seemed impossible. I found myself wondering if the same thing had happened to Amelia Emberton as it happened to me, only a much more sinister, unforgivable version. That she'd created a diabolical, twisted narrative to explain something unexplainable. That she'd retrofitted a justification, a reason, for her heinous crimes and her inexplicably good health at her age, to make sense of them. Or, what if... No, that's as far as I'll let my mind take me. The Barcenas moved out of that house, of course. While the property was on the market and vacant, I broke in one final time and sealed up the opening behind the panel next to the basement door, filled it in with concrete, just in case. I went to visit my mom that same night. I wanted to say just 3 words to her. I got her, but I don't know if she heard me.